northwest Queensland. Then Q&A. Later, the final Trump takes on the world.
Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, New South Wales health authorities are on the hunt for a mystery COVID carrier, the missing link in Sydney's latest outbreak. As Beijing hits back over its Belt and Road suspension, we ask how far down the path to war is Australia prepared to go? And the fight over an Aussie icon, a Western Sydney bootmaker takes on a US footwear giant over the beloved Ugg boot. Joining me on the panel, Adjunct Professor at Sydney University US Studies Centre, John Lee. Good to see you in person. Business owner and RedBalloon founder, Naomi Simson. Good to see you, Naomi. Good to see you. In Melbourne, oncologist, Dr. Ranjana Srivastava. Hello there. How are you?
Hello.
And in Canberra, federal politics reporter at the West Australian, Sarah Ison. Lovely to meet you, Sarah.
Good to meet you.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we're on Facebook. New South Wales is in a race against time to track down the missing link that sparked the latest outbreak of COVID in Sydney. So far, there are only 2 cases, the man who initially tested positive yesterday and his wife. Other close contacts have so far returned negative results. But the New South Wales Premier is not taking any chances.
We know for a fact there's at least one person, if not more, walking around with the virus, not knowing they have it or potentially having attended many events and venues, and that's why it's important for us to have the proportionate response. People can still enjoy Mother's Day, they can go about their business. Outdoors, you can do pretty much what you do now. But if you're in an indoor setting, just know that that's high risk. If you're in an indoor setting, wear a mask. If you're going to the supermarket, wear a mask.
Genomic sequencing has traced this case back to a returnee from the US who was transported from a hotel in Darling Harbour to Sydney health accommodation in late April. How the virus was then transmitted to the Sydney man from the eastern suburbs remains the big unknown. But the Health Minister, Brad Hazzard, says this case only reinforces the importance of getting vaccinated.
This is a very salutary reminder that this extremely dangerous virus requires us to get vaccinated as soon as we are in the categories that we are entitled to have that vaccine. Any reluctance to get vaccinated should be right out the door now that you've heard we have yet more cases here in Sydney. As we get our opportunity to get vaccinated, go and get vaccinated.
All of it is apparently too much for our friends across the ditch. New Zealand has now temporarily paused quarantine-free travel with New South Wales.
I do acknowledge that this is going to cause disruption for people who were travelling in the next 48 hours from New South Wales to New Zealand. This isn't a decision we take lightly, but we indicated when we opened up the Trans-Tasman travel bubble that we would continue to be cautious. We are continuing to be cautious.
Ranjana, it seems in Sydney, New South Wales, we know how the virus got out, and we know that a man in the eastern suburbs has it. We just don't know how it was transmitted from the one to the other. How much of a concern is that?
Well, I think, what this points to is the dynamic situation that keeps going in every country, including Australia. There are bits we know, bits we don't know, and I think it is concerning, but I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 24 to 48 hours we know more. So I suppose for the time being, yes, it's a mystery as to how the man contracted the virus, and hopefully more will become clear. But I think the broader message that I took away from today's disappointing news for Sydney-siders is, sort of, here we go again. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is going to continue to happen from time to time, which highlights what Brad Hazzard was just saying about the importance of getting vaccinated, and also in the meantime not becoming complacent about social distancing rules, wearing masks, hand hygiene, being in outside spaces as much as possible, especially with large gatherings, etc.
Yeah. Explain this to me though, Ranjana. We heard the Health Minister say get vaccinated. I think he managed to say it 3 times in 15 seconds. But at the same time, we're seeing some restrictions reapplied to aged care, limiting the numbers of people who can come into residential aged care communities, and that they must wear masks and so forth. And this includes in communities where people have had both doses of Pfizer and long enough for those to be effective. So what does that tell us about a future in which we have high numbers vaccinated if the restrictions are all still there?
Well, again, I think this points to the fact that we are also sort of making some decisions on the go and trying to understand and comprehend what this new vaccinated world of ours will look like. We are getting reports from India that there are people who are vaccinated who have still succumbed to COVID, who have died, although I don't mean to be alarmist at all, and it is still rare, and the vaccine is very effective. But I think there is just a lot of uncertainty. And one of the things that I think we should all be sympathetic about as a community is that people, public health experts, politicians, leaders, people are working through a lot of unknowns, so to speak. And you know, it remains to be seen what happens when we as a population reach herd immunity, what happens to breakthrough cases, who's getting sick, etc. And I would say, you know, we are still waiting to find all that out.
Naomi, you spoke very with much concern about the effect on businesses at the Valentine's Day shutdown. Do you remember in Victoria?
Oh, I remember the Valentine's Day, and then there was Easter, and now it's Mother's Day.
Yeah.
You know, every happy occasion we seem to have an outbreak. I do understand that no leader in this country wants to be the one that let it get away when the cost to Australians and the lockdowns throughout the country and border closures, we have paid a big price. The question is, do we continue to pay such a price, particularly for another weekend of celebrations? All of those restaurants, hospitalities, I myself tonight was off to a dinner, not anymore. And so...
Why have you cancelled?
I didn't cancel it. The event organiser cancelled it because just in case. So what we have is we have what seems to be a fair and reasonable approach. You know, now we need to all wear masks and we need to practice and remind ourselves of what the practice is. However, what happens is fear goes into the community and often people react. And how do we manage fear is we often say, right, I'm out, we're not doing this, let's just wait. And there's a consequence to that. And I am particularly concerned, particularly for those in hospitality, those in tourism and those who are out and about, yet again, are going to take the brunt of it.
Just out of interest, was there actually any need to cancel the event you were supposed to be going tonight based on what the Premier said today?
It was an indoor event and there was more than 50 people attending. So within the realm of what was said, yes. However, the caterers, all of the people have been hired tonight and somebody has to pay for that. So there is always a cost. We remember what happened in Valentine's Day, millions of dollars worth of flowers. And I'm also concerned, you know, I was so excited. I thought my son was going to visit me this weekend and that might, you know, airlines will be hit. Everybody will be hit yet again. But it is the fear notion that is causing people to react and maybe overreact. I happened to be in Byron Bay over the Easter period and we didn't get the Blues Festival and everything was shut down. And as a result, all of those... But that was a fear factor. It wasn't just government policy, it's how people respond to it because they say, well, I don't want to be the one to do the wrong thing. So it is human nature, but I do see that our society is very fearful as soon as something happens.
John, you're concerned about the messaging around vaccination. What are you hearing that concerns you or not hearing that concerns you?
Well, I think we've become a victim of our earlier success, where before it was about flattening the curve, we did that, or we didn't even go through that. Now it's about zero community transmission, and more broadly, it's about zero risk. The problem is that when the idea of vaccines came up, we, as the population, were looking for a roadmap about what a vaccinated world looks like, how we live with COVID when most or not all people have been vaccinated. And then we're suddenly told that a vaccine is not necessarily dangerous, but there are risks, which is true, there are risks.
Well, we saw the head of the TGA stand up today and say, look, 5 more Australians, you know, who didn't suffer fatal injuries by any stretch of the imagination, but they had blood clots. And some of them were in hospital. I think perhaps all of them were in hospital. But hey, it was 1.4 million people. And you're sitting at home going, well,
I
What
think
about those 5 people?
Well, I think once you have a zero risk mindset, you don't calculate risk particularly well. So, for example, the reporting now is that there is a chance of blood clots with vaccines, we're told. We're not told what those chances really are, or it's not emphasised what those chances are. The communication with the public is on the one hand that there is a risk and therefore we're going to ban it from people under 50, but on the other hand, go and take your vaccine. That sort of confusion, I think, is not particularly good for the road ahead, because the population doesn't actually know what a sensible risk management strategy becomes. And I fear that you're going to get a lot more people not getting vaccinated than they normally would, even though they wouldn't, in principle, have a problem with vaccination.
It's interesting, Sarah, you're a West Australian, I'll draw on that. Gladys Berejiklian was quite direct about her colleagues in Queensland and Western Australia today at her press conference in ways that may make the next National Cabinet meeting a tad awkward, saying that she was taking a measured and a proportionate response, and gosh, if this was Perth or Brisbane, they'd be shutting the whole state down. And this was under some quite intense questioning that went around and around and around about why mask wearing was necessary and limitations on the number of people indoors was necessary, which actually, to be frank, surprised me, the amount of questioning that she had to respond to today on those decisions.
Yeah, I'm glad you said you were surprised too. I wasn't sure if it was me as a Western Australian and being used to what McGowan might announce when there's a case and the sort of restrictions that are announced. I did find it, I was surprised when she announced some of those restrictions and there was this barrage of questions. I was thinking maybe I've just got this WA view, but it was interesting. I mean, even in McGowan's case, we had 3 days of lockdown last week now, or a little bit over a week ago. But there was, up until the very last moment, the expectation that we were going to go into a second lockdown after there was some more concerns in the contact tracing space. That didn't happen. There were restrictions that have only just started lifting. So I think there is a little bit more hesitancy from McGowan to be doing that, and probably a big reason is JobKeeper no longer exists. Before, you could really lock down things, you could close borders, and even if you do that for a week or two or whatever, people aren't really going to let employees go because they've got the $1,000 per head payment. Without that, if you put the state and the city into lockdown for too long a time, or you go on and off and on and off, you're going to probably see job losses. That weren't the case before, and it would be interesting to see how the public would react to that, because it simply didn't happen for the last sort of year because of that payment. So I think things are still shifting in that space. Yeah,
as Ranjana says, the whole thing is very dynamic. India has seen another record day of infections, with more than 400,000 people diagnosed yesterday. The Australian government is considering using Howard Springs to only quarantine returning Australians from India as a way to expedite the process when the travel ban ends. But Scott Morrison says the ban is having the intended effect.
The information I already have is the pause is working. The pause is putting us in a place to ensure that we'll be able to safely bring people home. And the early evidence indicates that that temporary pause to the 15th of May is on track. And that we are very hopeful and confident that on the other side of 15th of May, we'll be able to start restoring those repatriation flights.
It comes as the US agrees to waive intellectual property protections for coronavirus vaccines, potentially paving the way for nations like South Africa and India to produce more doses domestically. That leaves Australia as one of the last countries yet to back the waiver proposal. Now, this is important, Sarah, because if you waive that patent protection, India could produce en masse vaccines domestically without paying and seeking all the necessary approvals, commercial approvals from the pharmaceutical company. The US is actively working with the WTO to make that possible. What is Australia's objection to that?
Yeah, I'm not really sure why that's been so slow. TN this afternoon put out a statement. They were saying...
The Trade Minister?
That they were looking at doing this, but it was still quite non-committal. There was no time frame, there was no real detail there. And you know, the pandemic around the world is the thing that is right now the biggest concern to our government. It's imported COVID-19. We've heard from epidemiologists for a long time that really Australia is not 100% in the clear and safe once the world is really safe because of that risk of imported COVID cases. So why that hasn't been much higher on the priority list, looked at seriously, done at the pace of the US, I can't really grasp because of how clear that concern about global cases has been. So surely a way to tackle that is to do what the US is doing. So yeah, I'm not really sure what it's going to take there.
Naomi, patents are how businesses protect their intellectual property. You spend a lot of money developing a vaccine or some other product or sometimes service, and that's how you protect it. But it's not unprecedented in the business world to suggest this sort of thing, is it?
Absolutely not. In fact, you've got to think of the good of the whole. Within IT, we've had open source since the day dot. The internet itself is open source and made available to everybody for the good of the community. So I do find it interesting that this is a slow to move forward. I would understand that there would need to be, you know, when it's open source, there's also the quality control issues and they look at how it's executed. There's also shareware. So I understand the investment that has been made, the commercial investment, but what about the commercial impact of not having a massive part of the population, the globe, vaccinated? So that's the one thing I don't understand. Sometimes it's for the good of the whole, and you'll get a better commercial outcome when you've got the economies running properly.
Yeah, some cynical people say, well, maybe if the vaccine that we have now is not available as widely as it might be, you get variants and pharmaceutical companies make more money coming up with new vaccines to deal with the variants. Is that way too cynical?
Look, that is a viewpoint, but I also look to the fact that all of these big pharmaceutical companies have a ESG program, a social agenda, and I would ask them to look into their hearts and say, mate, perhaps this is where this belongs. I ultimately think that shareholders too need to have a say in this and step in and say, you know, we believe in impact investing, and one of those is supporting and looking after particularly populations who might not have access quickly and they need it. So yes, there might be variants, yes, there may be that, but that they could restrict under licensing, even free licensing, and they could handle that into the future.
Ranjana, my heart broke for you reading your article in The Guardian today, when you were writing about the lovely WhatsApp group you have with the women you went to school with in a convent school in Bihar, one of the poorest states in India, and I just imagine the dread you have checking those messages. Give me a sense of what you see when you look at those, scroll through those messages each day.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. I think, you know, India is an ocean of suffering right now, and I'm attached to my phone, but increasingly I feel as if I dread to pick it up. You know, our WhatsApp messages were very benign in the past, you know, a corny joke. In fact, there was a lovely joke of two Indian actresses who are older now, very famous. And there was this joke that one of them said to another, well, I haven't had my vaccine yet because it's only for the over 60s. And they're both over 60. So it was hilarious. And then overnight, really, a couple of weeks ago, the tone just changed. And a school teacher of ours was dying. A beloved teacher was in intensive care, requiring various drugs, various support. And, you know, I wrote in The Guardian about the fact that all of us who went to that school owe a huge debt to the school and to our teachers who believed in us when not much else around us worked. And they really imparted us with the kind of self-confidence that has allowed us to traverse the world. And it was very unfortunate that we were not able to do anything. We could only watch, even from India or from a distance. But the broader point I was making was that, in a sense, his death a couple of weeks ago would now be considered a good death, because since then, India has run out of oxygen. And there are no words to describe the sorrow and the fear and the impotence that is being transmitted through these chat groups, and this enormous sense of helplessness. Because, you know, sending money is good, but it's not going to make a difference in the immediate setting. Waiving IP laws is fantastic, but it might take months and months for the tech transfer to occur. And so and we're not there. We can't travel. We are enclosed. And so it's a really helpless, a feeling that I've never felt before. And I'm here in COVID-free Melbourne to a large extent. In fact, we haven't had cases for a while. And it's there's a palpable sense of anxiety and fear and sorrow. And very quickly, I think you were telling a story before about someone meeting an Indian person and saying, "How are you?" And I went to the gym for a run this morning, and on my way out, the gym manager is Indian. And I walked out deliberately turning my face away because I just didn't want to talk to him to find out more grief. And then I felt terrible and guilty. So I walked back in and I said to him, "How are you?" It's all you need to say these days. And it's almost inferred that when you are saying, "How are you?" you are talking about what's happening to your family in India. But this guy must be in his 30s. And he says to me, "Well, 3 of my classmates have died." And you're just speechless. I think Indians deal overall with great equanimity when it comes to an idea of being mortal. But this kind of mortality, this scale of suffering and death is just astonishing and very, very sad.
Mm. You write about one friend, old friends are the best, aren't they? And you describe this childhood friend as being, you are each other's anchor. And you write she has 25 close friends with COVID and has a driver driving around the streets trying to track down oxygen. Tell us, how does she decide who gets the oxygen and who doesn't?
It's incredible. So to add to that story, my friend is in Mumbai. Most of her relatives are in Delhi. So she hit upon this ingenious idea of starting an Excel spreadsheet. She's a doctor like me, not an Excel professional. And on that, throughout the country, wherever her relatives are, she gets them to plot their oxygen saturation every few hours. And her job, and she has other work to do, and her bandwidth and her mind is completely occupied by those numbers in real time. And so she has a driver in Delhi who she has hired to source oxygen. And how does she do it, or how does he do it? Well, she monitors the WhatsApp messages that say perhaps there's oxygen here today or there, or oh, something is available. And this driver's job, this poor driver, drives all around Delhi all day sourcing oxygen. And when he finds a cylinder, he rings her. And then she distributes that, she allocates that cylinder to the neediest relative. It's just unimaginable what people are doing in India to make things work. And then you hope that that person doesn't use up all the oxygen, that they get better, and that the oxygen can be used by someone else. And so it goes.
Mm. Ranjana, thank you for telling us that. I hope, our hearts go out to everybody. Is that the best thing to do, to just walk up to people, friends, people in your shops and all the rest of it, and just check in on them? Does that help?
Alan, I think compassion goes a long way. We are all struggling. We are all suffering. The Indian diaspora is huge, and everybody knows, you probably speak to a call center worker or a taxi driver or the IT person, or Australia has lots of health professionals. Mm-hmm. I think all of us are and people who are not of Indian heritage still have very close ties to India in many instances. And so I think when we are struggling and struggling against powerlessness and feeling, well, what can a person like me do? Well, you can just stop and say, "I'm sorry," or "How are you?" And I really do feel that that's the balm that we need, along with other action and proportionate actions from governments, from leaders. But on an individual basis, I think we can't go past kindness and empathy.
Thank you. So well said. Well, there's no way to make this transition, because the next 2 words are something that I always seem to say when Naomi's on the program. Yes. So brace, Naomi. Donald Trump will remain banned from Facebook following a ruling of the company's oversight board. You might remember that he was suspended following the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. Well, that's been upheld by the board, who act independently of Facebook and rule on some of the most controversial issues facing the company.
The board definitely found that there were severe violations of Facebook's rules. But then President Trump hosted content and contributed to an environment in which it was possible people were going to get harmed. And then, of course, there was terrible violence that took place in which 5 people died at the US Capitol. What we've told Facebook is that in the next 6 months, they need to go back and review this decision. And when they do that, they need to assess whether it's possible that users are going to face harm. And if it's likely that restoring President Trump is likely to lead to harm, then Facebook should suspend Trump again.
Trump has, of course, responded not on social media, but through the medium of his new website, From the Desk of Donald Trump. Donald J. Trump, my apologies.
What Facebook, Twitter and Google have done is a total disgrace and an embarrassment to our country. Free speech has been taken away from the President of the United States because the radical left lunatics are afraid of the truth. But the truth will come out anyway, bigger and stronger than ever before.
John, can I turn to you? Should Facebook be the arbiter of the truth?
Well, first I'd make a political point. If you are Facebook or anyone else and you want Donald J. Trump to go away, the worst thing you can do is ban him. Because look what happens now. It means his supporters are even more determined. We see statistically they grow in numbers every time something like this happens. Now, on the issue of whether Facebook should ban Trump or anyone else, I have to say I'm uncomfortable with private companies banning posts by public figures. The reason being that outlets like Facebook, I consider them publishers, and so they're part of the democratic process. People have every right to go on Facebook or any other publication to say what an idiot Donald Trump is.
Right.
But when there's a private group of people, even if it's an advisory board, when it's a group of people determining who should go on the platform and who shouldn't go on the platform, I'm uncomfortable with that.
Even if there's a risk of inciting violence, inciting hatred?
Well, that's a pretty high standard you have to meet. And yes, you could argue that Trump met that standard at the end of the elections last year. But then the question becomes, do you ban a former president who, no matter what you think of him, from engaging in a broad-based social media or publishing platform? I'm not comfortable with a liberal democratic country doing that. As I mentioned, people should be activated to go out there and say how wrong he is or how bad he is or whatever you want to say. But I think that is actually how our publishing system in a liberal democracy works. So I can understand a decision, but I am uncomfortable with it, and politically it's counterproductive because, as I mentioned, it actually helps Trump build a base for 2024.
Sarah, I mean, implicit in what John is saying is the belief that, we're supposed to have in the mainstream media, in broader media, journalism, more traditional media, that the truth will out. That all you have to do is put the truth out there and it will win the great arm wrestle with misinformation. And so let Donald go.
I don't know. I think I'm almost more uncomfortable, more fearful about this washing of responsibility, washing their hands of responsibility that Facebook and big platforms have done in the past, and up until now I've kind of gone, okay, here's this platform where someone like Donald Trump, it's almost handing him a megaphone to the world, and he can spray whether it's hateful, like violence inciting rhetoric or misinformation about treatments or for COVID and all these intensely harmful things. And we as the platform who are giving him that reach have no responsibility over the harm that causes.
And so that's the measure for you, it's the harm. You've got to measure the harm, and that's what you're looking at. It doesn't matter how odious, or it's not about misinformation for you, it's about harm, actual harm likely to be caused.
Absolutely. I understand how that's a difficult thing to measure. I know with this case, there is a concern of a precedent it would set if he was suspended for a longer period of time, suspended indefinitely, which Facebook doesn't have the power to do it at the moment. But I understand, because harm is such a, how do we classify harm, too much harm? It's such a difficult thing to measure. But to turn a blind eye to it when it has happened to horrific degrees with what's happened on the Capitol and so on, I think is reckless and irresponsible. I think if you have the power to reduce that harm, you should. And, you know, I know a lot of people can go on Facebook and say, oh, I don't like Trump or whatever, but, you know, a lot of these people, what are you going to reach? If you're just a normal citizen, you're going to reach 10 or 20 of your closest mates, even if you're in journalism, you know, a few hundred, few thousand of your followers or something. But Trump, I mean, he has this huge, huge reach across the world. It's reaching people from all demographics and background and beliefs. And, you know, I think that's just such a dangerous thing to go, here's the megaphone and you do what you will because the truth will win kind of thing. I just think that's really, really dangerous.
And Naomi, it's interesting, isn't it? Do you remember this bloke called Milo Yiannopoulos who used to give speeches, you had, you know, the shock of white hair, speeches ridiculing Islam, feminism, social justice, political correctness, profitable provocateur, taken off Facebook and I think Twitter as well, and by all accounts, bankrupt.
Yeah, we are.
So does it work?
Well, we are seeing that there is more editorial control across all of the platforms.
But does it shut them down, do you think?
Well, we do know that the YouTubers who have been at the extremes and that they have closed down, they've lost their income source. And as a result, that has had a commercial impact and they have to go and do something. I think what we're seeing here is editorial control and choosing one.
But Zuckerberg says, no, I'm not a media company, I'm just a platform.
Which they have maintained over and over again, but this action speaks to being a media company and a publisher. The action is speaking louder than the words in this circumstance.
How they've dealt with Trump demonstrates
that they're a media company. Their action is demonstrating that that's what they do. Now, what they have done with advertising, because people, influencers and so forth, would show a product, now by law there is a code of conduct and you have to do hashtag ads so that somebody knows, oh, this person is being paid to do that. Now, there also should be a code of conduct which is hashtag opinion, because, you know, he's claiming this is the truth. Well, that's his truth. That is his opinion. On what basis? Wikipedia is very, very keen to make sure you have the references, the way we used to have to write essays when we're at universities, always have the reference point. So I think this is a step that we as consumers need to keep arguing, well, what is the overall code of conduct, rather than picking the eyes of one or two, maybe making them scapegoats or saying, you know, this is inappropriate. But just behind Trump there is hundreds of thousands of others who are at every level of extremism just to get views, clicks, and we're seeing such a shift to the edges of extremism.
And in the end, if we're all the product on Facebook, including Donald Trump if he ever gets back on there, and the actual consumers of Facebook are the advertisers, I mean, that is a lot of the reason why commercial media keeps itself nice and clean, because they don't want to revolt by advertisers. So is that sufficient to get someone like Zuckerberg, just quickly, to say, we don't want to sell that product anymore. We don't want to sell Donald Trump because that's not what our advertisers want to buy.
I think you're closer there, because remember, the influencers are doing hashtag ad are not necessarily paying for that unless they're having to spend money to promote it.
Yeah.
So if they're just doing it to their regular base of who Facebook is going to feed that to, Facebook is missing out on a clip of the ticket. Facebook is an advertising organisation. That's what it's doing. That's its fundamentals of its business model.
So attack it that way.
Which also businesses like, because they like being able to target specifically the small group of people that they might be looking. That is the business model.
You are watching The Drama, and with me on the panel is Sydney University US Studies Centre Adjunct Professor John Lee, RedBalloon founder Naomi Simson, in Melbourne tonight, Oncologist Dr Ranjana Srivastava, and in Canberra, political reporter at the West Australian, Sarah Ison. For almost a year now, there's been no ministerial contact between Australia and China. Even as the tariffs mounted up on barley, beef, wine, Australian ministers were unable to get their Chinese counterparts on the phone. Well, now this seems to have been formalised. Beijing has announced the suspension of all activities under the China-Australia Strategic Economic Dialogue.
Recently, some Australian Commonwealth Government officials launched a series of measures to disrupt the normal exchanges and cooperation between China and Australia, out of a Cold War mindset and ideological discrimination.
Now, that follows weeks of sabre rattling here in Australia by senior government officials and military commanders, warning the drums of war are beating. Well, today, Scott Morrison has attempted to soften some of that rhetoric after Taiwan's foreign minister called on Australia to defend against Chinese expansionism. The PM made it clear that we are unlikely to see a shift in the government's position on the recognition of Taiwan.
We're very cognizant of the uncertainties in our region. I'm not one to, speak at length on these things because I don't wish to add to any uncertainty. But that's why we have the security arrangements we have in place. We have always understood the one system, two countries arrangement, and we will continue to follow our policies there. One country, two systems, I should say.
Sarah, just for clarity, we've seen published here in The Guardian the suggestion that Scott Morrison's got that wrong, that one country, two systems is not, in fact, Australia's policy on Taiwan.
And I think that's referencing Shadow Foreign Affairs Minister Penny Wong, who was really critical that he was getting that mixed up with the position on Hong Kong. And, Penny Wong, with her background and so on, I was, when I saw that published, I believe that's the case, that the PM did have a bit of a misstep, but I think there's a bit of confusion there. Hopefully he'd clear that up. But you can hear him sort of trying to not say too much in this space. I think some of that is why I'm saying, look, I don't want to add any more uncertainty, but here's the position. That's the sort of language I think we'll be seeing more of, this drums of war beating. A lot of that really visual rhetoric I don't think is helpful. And it also suggests that, the drums of war are beating, something's already happening, and a bit of almost finger pointing that someone else is causing some kind of war, and I don't think that's particularly helpful.
According to The Guardian, John, this one country, two systems, that's in fact China's position on Taiwan. Both sides of politics in Taiwan reject that idea, and apparently it's not Taiwan's position. You used to advise Julie Bishop. Would you have been sending frantic emails and chewing the end of your pen if you'd heard that on 3AW?
I wouldn't stress out about it because it is true that one country, two systems, that phrase is applied to Hong Kong, formally applied to Hong Kong. Our terminology applied to Taiwan is just one country. And
which country is that?
We recognise the People's Republic of China. We recognise Beijing as the one China. But at the same time, a long-standing Australian position with respect to Taiwan is that Australia opposes any forceful change of the system in Taiwan, namely by China. So
that's very good diplomatic language, which I would expect from you. I'd expect no less. But isn't that what you're supposed to say when you're the Prime Minister? You're supposed to say, we recognise one China, and then you're supposed to go blah, 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 Taiwan, blah, blah, blah. So it's just not quite clear what our position is on Taiwan, and that's our policy. We have unofficial relations with Taiwan. It's not a country, even though it really is, and there's only one China. That's Beijing. Got to be going now. 3AW interview over. Isn't that what you're supposed to do?
Well, look, I don't think the Taiwanese would have been too stressed out.
We're not worried about the Taiwanese.
I don't think our...
We're worried about Beijing.
Well, Beijing knows what our position is. We recognise the People's Republic of China as the only China in the world, but we oppose any use of force to change the system, which is different in Taiwan. So even though we don't use that two systems part with respect to Taiwan, we, in practice, recognise that there are two systems.
Better to get it right than wrong, though, hey?
It's true, but I honestly...
You don't think it's a biggie?
I really wouldn't stress out about it.
OK, for more on this, we're joined by Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne's Asia Institute, Melissa Conley-Tyler, who is currently in Taipei for a fellowship with the Taiwanese Foreign Ministry, looking at foreign relations under the Biden administration. Lovely of you to join us again, Melissa.
Thank you, Alan.
First of all, just take me to Beijing saying out loud, we're going to end... in the past, they've said, there's weevils in your flour, your wine's has been corked, all sorts of reasons why they didn't want our product. But now they're saying out loud, no, this is your Cold War mentality. We don't like it. We're not talking to you. How significant is that?
Look, my reaction was relief that China has found something essentially symbolic with which to vent its displeasure at the federal government ripping up the Victorian government's Belt and Road Initiative agreement. I mean, if you look at the damage that's been done to Australian businesses who sell lobsters and wine, it really could have been a lot worse. We've had the informal diplomatic freeze for a long time, but it's deniable, as you say, in the sense that China can say, oh, there's no diplomatic freeze and therefore can reverse it anytime it wants. All this means is that a particular dialogue that hasn't happened since 2017 won't happen, and it probably wouldn't have happened anyway. So from my perspective, I like that it's rhetoric and symbolism rather than anything more concrete.
And I mean, this is what you're looking at there in Taipei. You will have noticed from that distance that a hardening of the rhetoric here. Peter Dutton talking frankly about the fear that there will be conflict over Taiwan involving China and the US and perhaps us. It can't be discounted. Michael Pizzullo, a very senior bureaucrat, talking about the drums of war were beating. A very senior brass, Adam Findlay, saying that Beijing's already engaging in grey zone warfare against Australia. Is conflict looming? Is that what they're trying to tell the public in Australia?
Well, look, I've had a lot of people ask me that, are people on the streets in Taiwan terrified? And I suppose from their perspective, this has been a flashpoint, absolutely, but it's been a flashpoint for a long time. For 70 years. This is a relic of the Chinese Civil War when the nationalists lose to the communists and they come to the island of Taiwan. So, yes, there is Chinese, there are Chinese incursions into airspace, into the maritime area. Yes, those have got worse, and there is more a sense that China is pushing these grey zone tactics. But it's part of a continuum. It's not entirely new behaviour. So I suppose what I'd be asking is, what does Taiwan actually want from Australia? What does it want us to do? And the thing it wants is exactly what John said, which is that Australia opposes forceful resolution of this long-term and exceptionally difficult to resolve situation. And that's the message we should keep saying over and over again, that force should not be used in this situation.
John, I suspect you disagree with some of what Melissa's saying there, but can I ask you very simply, we seem to be faced with this binary. Either we stand up for freedom and democracy, or ultimately we go to war with China in defence of those two. That seems an extraordinarily naive binary to be setting up for a middle power like Australia.
I don't think that's the binary. I mean, that is a potential binary, but I don't think that's where the government's going. And I should say that I was part of a government for 2 years, from 16 to 18, so I had something to do with it. But the binary isn't we go to war or we don't stick up for democracy. It is that we and other countries, United States, Japan, and even India, we acquired a capability to make sure that it's extremely costly for China to actually go to war. And in doing that, we're trying to deter China.
Is that what all this language is about?
Well, I think it's two things. One, it seems like the Morrison government or its senior ministers have decided to be more frank with the Australian public about the situation on the ground, and I think what they're saying is accurate.
Why did we need to hear this? Because something might happen? Something
may happen, but it is incumbent on a democratic government to at least allow the public into what is actually happening in our region, which would have huge consequences, obviously, for us. But the second thing is, and you've seen this in a lot of the policies, particularly in the last 2 years, the government is talking about acquiring capabilities, working with allies and so on, to shape the strategic environment, to impose costs on those who want to use force. That is classic deterrence. And if you don't do that, the incentives for China to use force, for example, on Taiwan, actually increase rather than decrease. So I don't think it's that binary that you mentioned. We are trying to tell the Chinese collectively that there will be immense cost and disruption for them if they take the forceful option.
Sarah, this is interesting because what sort of calculation, is that the calculation that's being made in Canberra? Because there seem to be a couple of perspectives on it now. OK, push back now while China is still operating in the grey zone so that they understand that this is not inevitable. You cannot create the narrative in the world that it is inevitable that Beijing will take Taiwan and we will sit back and wait for that. You disrupt and you push back now and hope like hell that you never have to make a choice if President Biden gets on the phone and asks for support.
Yeah, I think you've got that right, that view. And it's particularly pertinent because I think it's that, you know, the frog that slowly boils and doesn't realise it's in a hot pot until it's too late. I think a sense is that sort of happened in the case of the South China Sea with these incremental, you know, moves and building of different infrastructure and so on that a foot should just have been put down way earlier or just that to have stopped. But now it's this incremental things that are happening in that space. Coast Guards being given, you know...
warplanes. 25 warplanes went over the skies. You probably heard them. Last month. 25 of them. And then Beijing put out the video of there they are. There's the video kindly supplied from Beijing of there's our military folks going into... well, I won't nominate exactly where because I'll get it quite wrong. Is it a Taiwan airspace? Gosh, can you imagine the correspondence if I've got that wrong? But, you know, I mean, we're a long way down the path and we're meeting it with drums of war. We imagine that Pizzulo, that very senior bureaucrat, is going to go over and be very senior in Dutton's Defence Department. So are there hawks in Canberra who are, I don't know, really countenancing this possibility, Sarah?
There are absolutely, yeah, hawks in Canberra for sure, you know, and I think they have for the last year or two been really strong in their language on the threat of China, on the risk of China, on, you know, you've got even backbenchers in the coalition who've talked about, you know, when we were complacent, the world was complacent in World War II or leading up until World War II, look what happened kind of thing. That's been happening for sort of 2 years and it is continuing and it is, you know, there is that sense that there are those hawkish characters in Canberra and that kind of language won't stop. I think there is that sense of you have to meet strength with strength or else it will be that, you know, give an inch, take a mile situation that you find yourself in.
Ranjana, can I turn to you? This is really interesting. I wonder whether the last few days and the backlash to the Friday night announcement to criminalise any attempt by Australians to return from India, you know, the politicians have reacted to that, right? We're hearing very different language out of Canberra this week. Might indicate that they're really acutely sensitive to public opinion on foreign affairs and whether or not this might be the moment for all of us to have a think as Australians about what we would be prepared to do in the end about any attempt to take Taiwan.
Good question, Ellen. And I would just say on the issue of meeting strength with strength with an increasingly ambitious and assertive China is you know, if I've learned one thing sort of in the last year when I've been studying for a Master of Public Policy at the Kennedy School, at the Harvard Kennedy School, and listening to, having had the privilege of listening to so many diplomats and world leaders, is never forgetting that aside from the public talk and sometimes the rhetoric, there is an undeniable place for quiet diplomacy, for conversations, for genuine communication. And one thing that, you know, that I think about China is being able to find areas where we can agree or at least where we can cooperate, whether that be climate change or intellectual property or cybersecurity or education, and whilst bringing up the issues of an assertive China and of human rights, for example, the treatment of Uyghurs, etc. So it has to be more than a sort of a dichotomy, either war or no war, and trying to engage China in a broader way. Which brings me to India and the absolute importance of the Quad and of Australia, the Australian-Indian strategic partnership, which I think is going to become more and more important with time. And I think this is partly sort of linked to this this feeling of dismay, complete dismay about what's happening in India vis-a-vis people who are returning home, and Indians who are returning home feeling that they are being criminalized and penalized, etc. Because not only will hard power be important in dealing with China, I think soft power and diplomacy is going to be important. And so Australia will need to be very conscious about actually keeping its friends closer as it deals with perceived enmity.
Can I go back to you, Melissa? You'll have had time to consider the likely economic implications longer term of China's, banning of various of our exports. But the one thing that hasn't been affected is iron ore, and of course the price of iron ore goes up and up and up to historic highs. I read that for every $10 increase in commodity price of iron ore, the federal government gets a $2.5 billion windfall in tax, and so we're likely to see that next week. But the Chinese have options. They're trying to get... the Chinese have options. They're trying to get African iron ore mines online, and they will, and then presumably they'll shut off the tap to us. How significant is that going to be for Australia economically, do you think, Melissa?
Oh, that would be massive, but it's not on the cards right away. China has chosen things that don't hurt it too much to exercise its displeasure. I mean, it's bad for Chinese consumers who would like lobsters and wine, but, it doesn't greatly affect China. Same thing for something like coal. They have their own incentives to try to build up their own domestic market. So the punishments have been carefully chosen, and iron ore would just hurt China too much now and for the foreseeable future.
And how long's the foreseeable future? So they've got this big push on, this big stimulus program. They've got the steel mills going round the clock, a 20% increase in the output from their steel mills, and you need raw iron ore to do that. How long do we think that will continue?
Yeah. Look, what I'm seeing is medium term, but I have to say I'm not an industry specialist. I would have to see the exact data on it, but certainly not right away. And that's the, what would you say, that's the window we have to try to improve the relationship and get it more to a normal diplomatic relationship.
Naomi, you think the impact on tourism could be unrecoverable?
I do, and if Australia is seen as an unattractive place, this will have a significant impact on the inbound tourism operators, of which we have many, and that's the flow-on effect. So it's not just the $100 or whatever in terms of what they might be spending on room nights or in tours, it's the impact onto employment. What we have seen, though, is that sort of outbound product, people are beginning to shift where they work, and there has been a lot of movement. We see that in the unemployment numbers. So we're two schools of thoughts. We have to be ready for when inbound tourists come. We don't know when that's going to be until everybody in the world's vaccinated. We can't plan for that, and until that time, we are seeing a great shifts in employment. But if we don't have foreign students coming into Australia and we don't have tourism, these are both very, very big economic drivers, and that will affect the economy because it takes time for business to adjust.
Melissa, let me ask you, you're trying to read the tea leaves on Joe Biden. What's Biden up to? Changing his rhetoric on Taiwan, going from that very useful position they've had of recognising Beijing and saying we have unofficial ties with Taiwan and everybody smile and move on. What are they doing? Because whatever they do, we may end up following them.
So it is something that we also are trying to do, which is to create more international space for Taiwan. Clearly, we recognise China, the US recognises China, that's not going to change. But the political status of Taiwan doesn't mean that we can't find ways to create space for it. So Australia, for example, has pushed to get Taiwan in the World Health Assembly because, whatever your political status, those issues are universal and need to be looked at. So what Biden's done is really just a continuation of what had happened under the Trump administration of trying to find more ways for international space. Still, there is no change in recognition, obviously, but there's more contact, more ways for informal contact, informal sharing. And Taiwan appreciates this very much. One of Taiwan's messages to the world is that Taiwan can help, and it wants to be part of these discussions where it can share and be part of international policy.
John, can I ask you, I mean, is there a risk do you see, and this is an important question in Australia, that Biden is provoking China and taking us towards a conflict that, in fact, Washington may have no appetite to fight?
I think the reverse, because if you look at when Xi Jinping started to formulate his fairly aggressive policies towards Taiwan, Taiwan's always been an issue, but Xi Jinping has really upped the ante around 2014-15, promising to deliver Taiwan, if by force, within the term of his leadership, right? So that could be 4 years, could be 10 years as leader for life. Now, that occurred at a time when the United States was probably more ambivalent about defending Taiwan, or Taiwan was probably less important to the United States then, at least to the Obama administration.
And therefore, we're nearly out of time.
And therefore, by Biden emphasising the importance of Taiwan, the idea is that this will actually discourage or dissuade China from making a move against Taiwan.
Let's hope you're right. No more drums of war. That's all we have time for. A big thanks to all of our panel. A very interesting discussion tonight. Thanks so much for